Good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Helen Brown from the Australia-Indonesia Centre based in Melbourne. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Kulin nations, of the land on which I am standing. I pay respect to elders past, present and future. Welcome to everybody here today to join us for this important discussion about a policy change that affects higher education. We are very fortunate to have some high-level people from the government and universities joining us. We're going to hold this as a panel discussion, and we will also be taking your questions as we go through the event. Now, unfortunately, we're having a little bit of trouble getting some of our panellists into the room. We are working on that. But in the meantime, we'll just forge ahead and get through as much information as we can, because as you know, this is quite a complex issue. The legislation around this policy change is now making its way through the Senate. The Senate has received a report which says to go ahead with the legislation with some changes, and that means it now has to pass through government with the expectation that that will happen in the November sitting. But of course, even if it does get through in November, that leaves little time for the universities to get prepared. However, the government did provide an estimate of what the universities or all training providers could expect with this student caps policy shift. And that gives them some time to get prepared. We're going to find out exactly how they're doing that, what are some of the challenges in doing that, and also hear from government about exactly what's in the legislation and why it has been put forward. Now, if you can bear with me as we get our panellists into the room, I am happy to say that Phil Honeywood, the CEO of the International Education Association of Australia, has been able to find his way. Phil, welcome and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Helen, and thank you to the Australia-Indonesia Institute for hosting this really important webinar on a very timely occasion.
Thank you. Of course, former Minister for Tertiary Education, Training and Multicultural Affairs for the Victorian Government, and he's led the peak industry organisation since 2011. Phil, perhaps could you just give us an overview as a leader of one of the peak industry organisations who's been involved in consultations around this policy, where things are sitting at now?
Well, Helen, as you mentioned, the legislation is yet to go through Parliament. The Senate Education Committee kept on adding new hearing days, which I think the sector was pleased with because it brought forth a lot of data that we were really keen on. Notwithstanding that, the recommendation from the majority of the senators on that Education Committee is that the legislation should be passed, and we don't anticipate, apart from some minor amendments around curtailing the minister's proposed power to, for example, dictate which courses a university might be able to, or any provider might be able to teach international students. Other than those minor amendments, we think that the bill will pass by the 28th of November, which is the final day of Parliament scheduled to sit. And we, of course, then it will be enacted. It's getting very close to the wire, however, because the indicative enrolment limit numbers, which every private and public provider, TAFE, universities, etc., who are registered to enrol international students, the indicative numbers are already out, and they will come into play from 1 January next year. I think in all of that, our biggest concern is Ministerial Direction 107, which many people on the call will be aware of, that came in just before Christmas last year from the separate Home Affairs Minister, which gives preference to the lowest risk-rated education providers who enrol international students. All of the in that category of level 1, and it has dictated that any other university or private provider that is level 2 or 3 can anticipate a slower period of time for their student visas to be processed. So typically Home Affairs Department is saying if you're a level 1 lowest risk provider, it will take 8 weeks to have a student visa processed, level 2 at least 12 weeks, level 3 16 weeks or more. And that really has led to an unfortunate situation of a logjam for some providers in getting enough student visas through. And so the key issue, I think, in talking about the nexus between the legislation that will determine the so-called caps, and then that should then require Ministerial Direction 107. The Governor promised I'll get rid of that, but it's what happens in between the legislation coming in, then January 1, and where we go with student visa processing, because it would be just diabolical if we have a situation like Canada's had, where the universities don't even get to the caps level, such as they are, because of student visa processing concerns. But the government's well aware of this, and we're working with them to try and fix it. I can't hear you, Helen.
Oh, there we go. Sorry, Phil. Those visa issues have been ongoing since, I think, early last year from memory, and are in a way, I guess, compounding what the universities are looking for next year. But if we put that aside for the moment, saying if the visa system works, does that, given that you've had a heads up, so to speak, does this now give the university sector time to adjust to the caps, which, you know, are indicative, have come out, and, you know, at least mean they can work with some of the student offers that have been made?
Yeah, very much so. So the indicative number is 270,000 new international student enrolments for next year, which in itself, on the surface, sounds like a lot, but it's going to be a lower number than recent years coming out of the pandemic. But you know, the key is that there's a number of other issues around exemptions, which I think it's important that we discuss today. We've been able to, I call them carve-outs. The department prefers to call them exemptions, but won't be included in the cap. So any school enrolment will not be included in the cap, and that's really important for Indonesian students who are coming, and other Filipinos and others from Southeast Asia who are coming to study in our school system, not included in the caps. Any high degree by research student won't be included. Any overseas government scholarships. Now, there will be some government scholarships that may not be supported there and may be within the caps, but most of them will be outside the caps, particularly for countries that we have very close relationships, such as Indonesia, the Philippines, Thailand, and most of the Southeast Asian countries. Equally, Australia Awards, where the Australian government provides scholarships to particularly our neighbouring countries outside of the caps. And the most important one I wanted to raise today was really the negotiations we're doing with government at the moment that I'm very much involved with in terms of twinning agreements and transnational education, where there's been a lot of work done, particularly as people on the call would be aware, with Indonesia, but also with countries in the Southeast Asian area in general, to have 2+2 programs, 1+2 programs, and the government have agreed on a broader definition than what we first thought they would come up with, that would allow for, in most cases, students who do, for example, 2 years offshore and then want to come to Australia to finish their course for another year or two, to not be included in the caps. And why that's important, that's a really important concession that we've been able to achieve.
Okay, so there is some movement there. I understand there's some consultation going on around those transnational arrangements, and we'll definitely get into that as an option later on. But those definitions haven't been nailed down quite yet, Phil, is my understanding. That's something that sounds like it's going in the right direction for the industry, but not quite pinned down yet.
Within days, we've been told by the Education Department to expect a what do they call it, an FAQ, a frequently asked questions sheet will come out that will explain. It's going to be an Australian qualification, or Australian qualification can't be recognised by the overseas government. It's got to be evidence of Australian delivery.
Let's take a look at the numbers. And actually, in a way, this has worked out, Phil, because we only have you for 20 minutes. I think you've been dragged to Canberra. I shouldn't say dragged. You've been asked to come to Canberra and you've got meetings. So we can talk to you in this time and get this baseline. When the numbers came out, there was a lot of concern initially that universities were going to have drastic reductions. It was going to create real problems for revenue generation. There were going to be huge, slashing was going to be done across the board. The numbers have come out, and while there are definitely those who have had their student cap numbers slashed, there are others where it's not so bad and others have made gains. Now, if I think about the people we've got in the room, the University of Queensland, the change for them is 0.1%. And for Melbourne University, it's a lot bigger for them. I think it's around 7%. So there's quite some variance there as well. But, there were 23 universities who can enrol more international students than they had in 2023, and 15 are seeing a reduction. So has it been quite the impact that it was thought it would be, given those numbers?
I think it's important to recognise that Australia has an ecosystem of international education providers, that 1/3 of our course delivery is done by non-university providers, be it public TAFE in the vocational sector or private higher education, private vet. Now, many of those private providers are very good at doing niche courses in engineering, IT, in allied health, and we really need to, realise that they have been more severely dealt with by the caps. So the formula that's been used for them is maximum 67.5% of last year's enrolments. They're entitled to have as new enrolments. And so, in the ecosystem, yes, public universities are winners and losers in terms of the enrolment limits they've been provided, as you mentioned, but the separate 1/3 of providers in English language, in vocational, in private higher education have been more severely impacted. Now, I guess I was also point that the government, in announcing the caps originally, talked about, Helen, having a variation cap if you were going to deliver courses that were skills in demand in Australia. Mm-hmm. And for example, the Filipino market, the Philippines weren't in our top 5 student source countries of any state in Australia until 4 or 5 years ago, when the Nursing Federation increased the English language entry level for enrolled nursing. And overnight, we found a lot of countries like Korea, Japan, that had provided nurses, found that higher English language entry level was a step too far. But for countries like the Philippines, where English language is part of the native language options, we now have incredible numbers of Filipinos coming into.
Oh, seem to have lost Phil. Oh no, he's coming back. Sorry, Phil, we just lost you for a moment there.
Sorry.
You're right.
We're hoping that. Yes, can you hear me now? Yep. You can hear me? Yep. Sorry. So we're hoping that the government will make good on that commitment to allow for a higher cap for providers, be they public or private, who are delivering skills in demand in Australia, such as nursing and aged care. And that will benefit countries like Thailand and the Philippines and Vietnam, potentially, where we need more workers and more migration pathways if they come and study in Australia.
Mm. Thanks, Phil. We have a question from the audience, and I'm going to take it because it talks to a little bit of what you are mentioning. And at this point, I'd like to mention Rongyu Lee from the University of Queensland. Thank you, Rongyu.
Apologies.
No, you're not alone. It's apparently a bit of a challenge to get into this webinar for some reason. So thank you for persisting, and great to have you with us.
Thank you.
I'll introduce you in a moment properly, but I'm just going to put this question to Phil Honeywood, who's been talking about the transnational education situation in regards to the caps and how we are a few days away from understanding how those caps will apply to those transnational arrangements and the scholarship arrangements. So we have a question, are students who complete initial studies online excluded from the caps? As an example, if a student studies online for a year at an Australian university from their own country, then comes to Australia for their later years, which I think is what you were talking about, Phil, like the 2x2 or the 1x3, for instance.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. It will depend on the program and the extent to which the Australian University is involved in delivery. But from what we've been told prior to the announcement in the next few days about the definition of what will be exempt in the transnational education space from the caps, then online delivery will be included. It will come down to the qualification, the type of course it is. So, for example, if it's a degree program where 1 or 2 years is delivered offshore and the student comes to Australia to finish the degree program, that should be fine. Where it's a separate qualification, so, for example, where they do most of the degree offshore and then they come to do a master's, that may not be exempted because it's regarded as a separate qualification, the master's to the degree program. So there's, at the moment, we're hearing that online delivery, provided that it's recognised by the national regulator, should be okay.
All right. Thanks very much, Phil. And I'm going to ask you a question about transnational education as well, Rongyu Lee, but I thought I should introduce you properly first. Rongyu Lee is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Global Engagement at the University of Queensland. I should also mention he's a board member for the Australia-Indonesia Centre, a new board member. So welcome, Mr. Lee. Great to have you with us. Previously held the Deputy Vice-Chancellor role at the University of Canberra and Executive Director International for RMIT University and Deakin University in Melbourne. So obviously there's some real depth of experience in the international field. Rongyu, could I just ask you to explain briefly where University of Queensland is at around this change in policy over student caps?
Thanks very much, Helen, and glad to be on the panel together with Phil. And I think I can't see Michael yet, but hopefully they will be joining us very shortly. I do think, the policy is very disruptive. I don't think it's well considered and thought out. What is really worrying is I think it is making the institutional autonomy diminishing. It's very difficult for universities to plan ahead, both from a student, load planning point of view and from budgeting point of view, especially given the short time frame to implement it. I know we've got Department of Education colleagues joining us, but I think even they are struggling with a short time frame. What we are struggling with is actually the uncertainty it has caused, not just actually for us, but for students and their parents. Investing in higher education in Australia, that's a big deal. It involves a lot of actually commitment. And the average pipeline, based on the number of years I've been in this international education sector, is actually 14 months, from first point of inquiry to actually commencing. And now, because of the delays with the Senate hearing, Senate report, and then what is remaining, to the end of the year in terms of the parliamentary sitting days, we are really, really left, with a few weeks. And if you actually go back to what I talked about, the average pipeline of 14 months, a lot of students have already got offers in their hand. Do they accept or not? Do we keep making offers or not? And this is only just one part of the very big puzzle, because we're still waiting on Home Affairs and Immigration Department processing visa promptly. So even if actually we make enough offers, we still don't know if we are ever going to hit the cap if we experience visa delays as we have in 2024. I do think, that is actually the challenge. The biggest issue for us is we can't understand why we are doing, so much reputational damage to the Australian international education sector when the sector has been actually very resilient and entrepreneurial by actually solving, problems the government is finding it difficult to solve which is actually funding the sector adequately. So I think, Phil would know this much better than I do, being an ex-minister in the Victorian state government and being an ex-politician. I think the University Australia CEO was right, and it is good politics, but it's actually not so good policy.
Rongyu, I can.
Sorry,
you
Helen,
have to go.
I have to go. But just before I run off, I should mention Rongyu has been an outstanding IEA board member for many years as well. So we really appreciate his leadership in our sector. Before I go, I just wanted to quickly mention the two-way exchange of students. And Penny Wong, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, has just appointed a new Colombo Plan scholarship steering committee, which I'm proud to be a member of. It's been chaired by Assistant Foreign Affairs Minister Tim Watts. And Indonesia and many countries in Southeast Asia, the number one, number two, number three study destinations for 13,500 young Australian undergrads who are going on new Colombo Plan mobility programs every year, plus a scholarship program. So there's going to be a preference now given for a minimum of 4 weeks for these programs. Many of them are Indonesian universities and NGOs. A preference is also going to be given in the new guidelines to intensive language learning. So Australian undergrads going to Indonesia, going to Thailand, doing foreign language learning in those countries as well. And just important to recognise that particularly Indonesia, but other countries in Southeast Asia can anticipate having healthy growth in young Australian undergraduates coming in and spending periods of time studying with them as part of this really wonderful attempt to try and get not just students from Southeast Asia into Australia, but more young Australians offshore as well. So I'll leave it at that and wish you luck with the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Rongyu, just back to the point around the disruption from your university's perspective about this policy. In the wash-up of numbers, the University of Queensland didn't receive a huge reduction in numbers. It was 0.1% from 2023. So some people might be asking, why are you so concerned about not being able to fill student offers and not being able to make student offers even, given that the numbers are not that much different?
I don't think we've actually stopped making offers. We are continuing to process applications coming in because there's just too much uncertainty for us to preempt any actually decisions prematurely. And I think the number given is very arbitrary. It's not based on accurate enrollments at the university from actually back before COVID in 2019 to actually 2023. And then there's also a lot of assumptions for 2024. In fact, 24 numbers, they didn't even actually include a semester 2. And we all know, because of the difference in academic calendar between Southern Hemisphere and Northern Hemisphere, between semester 1 and semester 2, I think the number of commencing students is very actually small. It's not a big gap anymore between semester 1 and semester 2. So I think the department used assumptions rather than actually actual enrollments, because we made lots of offers just to anticipate there will be attrition issues. There will be people actually failing to lodge visa applications early enough to make it to semester commencement. But in the end, throughout 2024, we've got visa delays. So we've got hundreds of students who accepted our offer, paid the deposit, and made the visa application, but they didn't get the visa application processed. So we've got hundreds of students missing out. And that was probably assumed that, based on the number of offer letters, that we would have more students, but we didn't. So I think the methodology is hard for us to interpret in terms of whether they've got very accurate number to actually come up with the allocated number that we've got. We've been told, in fact, there has been no consultation. So we're not slowing down, even though we are seeing application numbers started to slow down. I think the reputation certainly has been damaged, and that uncertainty is actually giving people some anxieties in terms of whether they should be coming to Australia, because we are not seen as welcoming anymore. But at the institutional level, I don't think it's necessarily the 1% or 2% or 5%, 7% for some institutions difference. It's actually hard for us all of a sudden to actually follow some sort of a managed growth trajectory. And all of a sudden, that pause button has been pressed. So,
okay. Sorry, Rongyu, I'll just pick up on a couple of those points. So, in fairness to the Department of Education people who are still trying to get in, I think they would say that they have been consulting. Government would say that they have been consulting. So we can hopefully check that with them. I appreciate that to you in the sector, it might feel different. And secondly, this touches on the reason why we're here. What is going to be the impact of this on our relationships with Southeast Asia, with Asia? A neighbouring region, or part of the region that we're told we need to develop stronger ties with. So it sounds like you're receiving feedback already about how this policy shift is being perceived in the region. Is that correct?
It is. I've just come back from China and Japan. I got back, to Brisbane on Saturday afternoon. So, I've got people, asking me about what's happening here. And especially when people understand what's already happened in Canada or in the US or in the UK. I think what people struggle to understand is, well, this is a very successful sector, and Australia is punching above its weight. We've got a small number of universities, but we've got a proportionately larger number in the top 100 globally based here, and this is the only sector that they are seen as environmentally friendly, and it is also about actually creating knowledge workers, for both Australia and the rest of the world. Why are we actually closing the door? So I think that there's some actually challenges for people to reconcile. We should be celebrating. We shouldn't be actually closing the door. I do think that has damaged lots of our reputation. But I do actually advise people, both individuals and institutions or government agencies, because you have to take the Australian political context into consideration. We've got very short electoral cycles, and for that reason, we always see policy changes, fluctuations, and there doesn't seem to be that consistency because we change government very often, and often in the months leading up to a federal election, we always see migration getting the center stage in terms of political debate. Unfortunately, international students get lumped into that broader conversation about what is the right size for Australia, whether we need a big Australia or small Australia, how do we address the labour shortages. I think if we were smarter, we would probably decouple that. The student, coming to Australia on a student visa, they are temporary visitors. Although some of them actually pursue permanent resident visa post-study, but these days, a lot of the students do return home, because there are much bigger economies around us. Just look at actually the population size in China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, you name it. They're all bigger economies and bigger populations. There are more opportunities. What they really want is to get a Western qualification, get a better understanding of actually the Western culture, way of doing business. In fact, you can't find better ambassadors for these people who actually come and study and take, that friendship home. It does contribute to, soft power and public diplomacy, but we are not recognizing those broader benefits of international education, we actually only see some of the problems which are structural in Australia, and they can't be resolved by actually introducing a cap to international students.
One of, I guess, the possible side effects of this shift is to clamp down on people who aren't offering a higher quality education, on providers who perhaps are not meeting the standards that we would like, that ensure that those international perceptions and relations are strong. Is that not a good goal to have, even if it's just in the having to make a policy shift in the short term, to try and manage that situation better and to level the playing field a bit more as well? Can you understand it from that point of view?
I do. I can understand it, and it's a good question, Helen. But I do think it doesn't take a imposed cap to address those problems, because there are existing legislative instruments and government agencies who could actually be the gatekeeper. The challenge is the regulators, both higher education and vocational education and training sector. We all have our governing bodies, right? In the higher education case, is TEQSA, Tertiary Education Quality, Standard Agency, and for the VET, sector, vocational education training, we've got ASQA. So we have those legislative agencies and instruments. If they have done their job properly, we probably wouldn't have had, so many, dodgy agencies coming into the sector to actually, make profit rather than actually provide a quality education. I do think, that needs to be addressed and ironed out. And in fact, that is why we need very accurate information about students, where they come from and where they are studying, whether they are genuine students, whether they are here for a migration outcome. I'm not saying, people come here to pursue a migration outcome is wrong, but I think they need to come through, more legitimate channels.
And in fairness,
yes,
hopefully when the Department of Education people come on, we have to make it clear that they're not in charge of visas or immigration or those matters. That's, of course, Home Affairs. But I hear what you're saying. Rongyu, I just wanted to let people know that we are trying to get the other panellists in the room. We're not sure what the situation is or why we're having some problems, and we do apologise for this. Obviously, this is not the intent of the webinar, so we are working frantically behind the scenes to try and have the other speakers join us. It is, of course, wonderful to have you to chat to with your knowledge and experience, Rongyu Lee from the University of Queensland. So while we wait for the others, I'm certainly going to pick your brain a bit more. Let's dip into transnational education, because it seems to me that one of the aims of this policy is to encourage universities to think about that more as an avenue, which means that, for instance, students might start studying in their home country, they'll do a couple of years there, knowing that they can come to Australia at some point and complete their studies. So, these kinds of arrangements are becoming more popular. We also have Monash University setting up a campus in Indonesia. There are, RMIT has one in Vietnam. These are not easy things to do, but do you see that this avenue is now something that universities will look more at, the transnational education that they provide?
It's a very good question. I think Australian universities have always been proactively pursuing those opportunities. But I think at the offset, we need to understand that this is not an either or. So, transnational education is not necessarily a substitute for onshore studies. I think, education provision, the more places we can reach, the more students we can reach, the better it is for humanities, especially developing countries who actually desperately need knowledge workers, to help with build their country and the national economy. When it comes to these different operating models, I think, is institutional decision making. For example, you mentioned Monash, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, and elsewhere. And RMIT, when I was at RMIT, I visited the Vietnam campus, often. I think sometimes these things were deliberate. Other times they were like all of a sudden the opportunity, calling, and you respond to it. Sometimes I think when universities talk about how to internationalize their education, they do actually look at the whole basket of programs. Some of them focused on onshore, others focused on hybrid, a bit of offshore, a bit of onshore, and others, like the fully fledged campus, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, you name it. I think the challenge here, from the government perspective is, don't actually get everybody to come here and study. You teach them actually offshore. I think this is where things got mixed up. Ideally, you'd want to have actually many different channels, many different vehicles for education provision to reach more people. But from a migration point of view, from housing point of view, this is probably the wrong place to start the conversation. I think the right place to start the conversation is how can we redistribute the risk profile, by not just having a single way of offering, the high quality education to an international audience. But if we are relying on, offshore offering, then, most of them transition to onshore. That's not happening. I think it's accommodating different student cohort, different, economic abilities to afford the education. I think you need to have that as a hybrid model, but not as a replacement model, because if people can well afford it, I think the first preference is still to come here to Australia to get a holistic international study experience, not just their qualification, but you live, you work, you interact with people in Australia, but also from around the world. So you get actually a holistic package rather than just actually the education qualification per se. So I think that's more valuable. And also it actually helps contribute, better understanding between peoples and countries. And you reduce, misunderstanding, miscalculation, etc.
Thank you, Rongyu. I want to go a little bit further down that track, but in the meantime, I just wanted to say that we do seem to be having problems getting the Department of Education speakers into the room, and I'm sorry about that. There's something about the link. Some people are using their phones to log in, which seems to be working, and thank you for that tip from one of our attendees. The department is also willing to take questions on notice. So I think, they're very keen to engage, and they are listening to the session to learn more, particularly around the policy implications and regional relationships. So we'll keep going on that path because, that is why we have this, why we're having this webinar and why people are in the room. Now, Rongyu, you've already spoken about the feedback that you're getting from different countries in Asia when you travel there. But is there any understanding of why the Australian government is making this shift? Because every country has their domestic politics, they have their domestic policies and needs that they have to be mindful of. Is there any understanding in Southeast Asia that this is also a domestic policy, and it may not be something that lasts forever? Maybe it's just an adjustment.
There is some level of understanding, because in the last few years we've seen, chop and change, happening a lot with change of government. But it takes a very well-educated and well-informed individual to actually make sense out of it. So I think, it's our collective responsibility and obligation to communicate with our, key partners and, future students, and also, different agencies. And this is why I think this webinar is all about, to have a conversation, to help people understand better. If we don't get other panelists to come and join us, we could always actually repeat, the webinar again, taking, what we've learned from this particular, webinar. But I do think it is worthwhile for us to communicate to our key stakeholders that, this is what I call political noise. When you actually try to focus on your core business, you really have to actually cancel some of the noise and take a much longer term view of actually what is going to eventually pan out. I do think culturally and politically in Australia, we often don't take that long-term view, but our Asian neighbors do. You look at actually, Vietnam, Indonesia, ASEAN countries, all up, but also in North Asia, countries do a lot of nation building by having very, long-term strategic planning. Then they actually execute that strategic plan. So there's policy consistency. And that's something we don't enjoy here. We look at actually short-term, policy responses, and we look at trying to look for short-term gains. But education is actually about, human life and livelihood, and it's about actually the future prosperity and well-being of individuals. It is a lifelong investment. And these days we talk a lot about lifelong learning. I think for our audience, both education providers and students, we really need to think about that long term. If, as a student and as parents, we are making a decision about our future, let's actually cancel the noise. Because Australia, after all, is still a very high, quality education, country, and the education system is still very sound. And I don't think any other country is as well regulated as we are, because we've got the ESOS Act. We've also got actually the Migration Act. So governing the quality of education provision, but at the same time, actually making it very clear that students have, their rights, to be protected. So really, I think it's a very good framework. Unfortunately, sometimes we don't talk about those, benefits and often enough. And I think people
right. Sorry, Rong, you're talking about the framework, though. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to put to you from our audience. You were talking about how Australia looks after its international students. The question is, do we have educators with the training and experience to deliver a holistic experience for international students? This guest studied for 2 years as an international student to learn how to teach other international students, but he found many others did not. So what, do we have that high standard all the time when it comes to looking after the international students that we've brought into the country?
Yeah, well, I'm somebody who actually favors continuous improvement. We've done well, but there is always room for improvement. Certainly, legislative speaking, I can't find another country in terms of the major English-speaking education exporting countries having as well a watertight framework as we have. So I do think we are governed and by the ESOS Act, the national standards, what we have to do in terms of communicating with students. And in terms of student welfare, there's not just actually what we have to comply with from ESOS as a national code, but there's also actually Australian other legislative instruments in terms of, duty of care, Health and Safety Act, Privacy Act, you name it, because they all apply. And no other country, I don't think, have a tuition protection scheme. For example, if a dodgy provider or any provider, go into financial difficulties, they can't continue offering the education to the students, there's a framework to actually replace the students in another institution, and their tuition fee is protected. So I do think, that part of it is very well established. And then universities in terms of student support services, student health cover, general well-being, that's all happening on campus, but also outside of campus. I think it's a reasonably satisfying experience for our students, although some students do find it difficult to make friends, with Australians, for example. I think some of it is cultural, and some of it is actually, having a lot to do with whether Australians are prepared, to get to know our Asian neighbours. I think that's an area that, more work could be done to make sure there's better integration, better actually cross-fertilizing, cross-learning. Certainly as a university, we've learned a lot from actually our international student body in terms of their preference when it comes to teaching, learning methodologies, how we actually learn to organize them to do group work, because previously we probably didn't have that experience.
Right. Thank you, Rongyu. I think there will be many views about that, and I'm just checking the messages to see, but I appreciate your response. One thing we haven't touched on yet is the new Colombo Plan. Now, I know that's not necessarily your specific area of oversight, but it would be good to talk about it a little bit. The new Colombo Plan, of course, has sponsored many Australian students into going overseas. And a very brief explanation, which we were, of course, going to get from our government friends, was around the changes that are taking place, which include having students stay longer in country. So 4 weeks instead of 2 is one of the changes to ensure they could immerse themselves more fully. And as someone who has been with AIC, which will be well known to many of you, in-country studies, a consortium of universities, it's amazing to see and wonderful to see the change that Australian students have when they're in country for a longer period of time. But there's also concern that not everyone can afford to leave Australia for 4 weeks, and that such a policy, for instance, might disadvantage those who are already having to hold down, say, part-time jobs while they study, for instance, who may not have the support to leave for that long and pursue that wonderful, intense opportunity. Rongyu, how important do you think the new Colombo Plan is to higher education in Australia? And do you think these changes, what you know of them, are going to be of a benefit?
I think the new Colombo Plan is one of the signature, foreign policy sort of, schemes in Australia. And I'm really glad that, when we had the change of government, the Labor government kept going with it, because it actually serves Australia's national interest. It's not just actually about student mobility, getting more Australian students to go to Asian neighbours, but it's more important to actually, as a continuation of the original new Colombo Plan, was about bringing, Asian neighbours to come and study in Australia and understand Australia better. And that has actually delivered the key objective. I think many of those graduates, then later on became national leaders, and they helped with bilateral, multilateral relationships. And they always have actually positive stories to tell about their experience in Australia. So the new Colombo Plan is a reverse of that, because all of a sudden we realized as much, as many migrants as we have, as a country, I think we don't have sufficient Asian literacy. So we do need to actually send Australian students out to understand our neighbours better. I'm very supportive of the changes the government is proposing. I do think, for people to stay, in the neighbouring countries longer, they develop actually much more in-depth understanding of our neighbours, cultures and politics and, just the people and the way in which people do business. But I think, like the international student cap, if we actually start to socialise, what could be improved before we make an announcement, that would have been better. And it would be better still if we actually consulted with receiving countries and receiving universities, I think it would be even more helpful in terms of what can be easily implemented. It's not just the financials, but it's also, a lot to do with curriculum, credit recognition, timing, because we've got different academic calendars, and how do we actually support both students and academic staff leading those groups to visit our neighbors. I think some of those details, certainly that's how universities operate. If we have an idea, we need to actually socialize that idea. We need to consult. We need to turn that idea, into more mature sort of a, concept, and then we have to test it. How can it be implemented? How is going to be resourced? But I thought this introduction of changes, its intent is great, especially with longer programs and also a language component, etc. Full scholarships, longer-term study for languages. That's just great. I do actually commend the foreign minister for doing it. But I think
in this short, sorry, I'm just conscious we've got 5 minutes left, and in that short time, and thank you. I know we've got some people attending the webinar who might have a bit of knowledge around New Colombo Plan as well. So if you'd like to put in some perspective on that, that would be fantastic. It'd be good to have that perspective if you've worked with government on this issue. I know there's an expert panel that's been set up to look at the changes that are being proposed and to ensure that they hit the target. So I think I should just mention that as well, that there are, there's some form of consultation that way. As well.
In fact, our Chancellor is on it. Mr. Peter Varghese, who was the Secretary of DFAT before he came and became the Chancellor of the University of Queensland, he's on it, and we are keeping him informed.
Great. And then we do have a nice question here from Melanie. The department has capped the international student number to 270,000. A number I didn't mention, and I should have, but I just presumed everyone in the room will know that. Is there any indication that the education or department or the government will let us know once the 270,000 has been reached? Have you got any indication of that as an announceable, Rongyu Lee?
That's actually a very interesting number, because that 270,000 it actually includes both higher education, vocational education, and training. So for higher education, I think we've only got 145,000. I think it's an arbitrary number, and when we are struggling already across the whole country with accurate data, it is very difficult to actually come up with a mechanism to actually determine, when that number is going to be reached, right? So that's, that number I'm assuming is actually students who are getting a visa who will be coming to study onshore. But to get there, you still need to have a buffer in terms of making enough offers, because there are people who actually apply, receive an offer, but they don't necessarily accept that offer. So you need to have actually a buffer there. The other buffer, which is actually even more critical, is actually the visa grant. So you may have actually made enough offers and got enough acceptances, but if the visa processing is not up to speed, the whole country may never actually reach that number. So I think that's why I think those details, especially interdepartmental working relationship, that needs to be improved to make sure that we don't actually have the two buffers working against each other. So it's anybody's guess, I think, being in the sector for as long as I have, when that number is going to be reached, because you may reach it very quickly from the number of offers you make, and students receive them, etc., and accept and pay the deposit. But
so maybe maybe we can put that question to government as well. I think
so.
from the sounds of
I
it.
think it's not just the Department of Education. I think next time, if we want to repeat this webinar, we probably need to bring somebody as a panelist from actually Home Affairs.
Yes, yes. Well, we'll put that forward to them because they have kindly said they'll take questions that have been raised. So we'll put that to them as well, and we appreciate that. And the visa situation, yes, that's definitely a Home Affairs Department issue, not the Department of Education. The breakdown for those numbers is 145,000 for public universities, 95,000 vocational, and 30,000 for others, just to clarify that. And that's from one of our attendees as well. So it's always good to have smart people in the room. And that is where we will have to leave it, I'm afraid. Rongyu, it's been great to have you on the show.
Well,
I appreciate that.
Another time. So
yes, we will. We will. There's obviously, I think there's something around corporate accounts maybe that we need to look into. I appreciate, Rongyu, that you made an effort to get in. We, of course, had Phil Honeywood, the CEO of the International Education Association of Australia. You, with your long experience in the international university sector, and we have had the Department of Education very willing to join in and willing to take questions. So we'll put those questions to them. Again, thank you to everyone who joined us, and I do apologise that it hasn't worked out as planned. However, I hope that it has been an interesting discussion, that you've learned something new and certainly got some perspectives about how Southeast Asia is viewing these policy changes, because these relationships with the region have been very hard fought, and as the AIC is a consortium of universities and we work with Universities Indonesia, we thought it was important to have a look at this and think about the long term as well as the short term. So thank you again, Rongyu.
It's a pleasure. I'm also very happy to receive questions and happy to engage.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all those who joined. Much appreciated. And we will hope to see you soon at our next event.
Thank you. Bye for now.